Hello, so this video is looking at Nazi racial policy between 1933 and 1935. The video is specifically for my teaching group as part of the EdXL specification, the breadth with depth study of Germany 1871 to 1990, but other listeners, viewers will hopefully find this of value to them as well. Okay, so let's push straight on. As always, or not always, but as often in lessons, I try to sort of include a little knowledge retrieval quiz, so I won't bother reading those. You can have a quick go of that yourself. Obviously, the advantage of a YouTube video is unlike a lesson where you can't pause me, YouTube lesson you can pause the video and take the time over the individual slides. So there are 9 questions, 3 from last lesson, 3 from last month, and 3 deeper knowledge going back in time. The answers are on the next slide. Okay, so there are the answers to those. So hopefully you did okay, and if you didn't, then the whole point about knowledge retrieval is a little bit and often and repetition, just going back over deliberate practice to put the information into your long-term knowledge. Sometimes we call that fingertip knowledge, okay, sort of historical knowledge that you can automatically retrieve because it becomes automatic, the process of knowing this information. That's what you should be aiming for. Another standard slide for the start of lessons, just to give you the big picture. Again, that's all part of knowledge retrieval and putting in the long-term memory as if you can relate everything to what the bigger picture, to what has happened before and also what is happening afterwards. So as you can see, this particular lesson, the racial policy, is the culmination of a whole series of lessons where we've been focusing on the Hitler's Germany. And as you can see there, the majority of the lessons have been about the depth study, but the recent lessons have been mainly for the breadth study. Okay, now in the breadth study, of course, you'll only write one paragraph about Nazi Germany, probably because you're writing about a whole 120 years of history and fitting Nazi Germany into the relevant section. This particular topic, racial policy, actually can be brought into a breadth study question about the development of society, because policy towards the Jews is very much of a social issue, but you could also include it as part of it could also be a specific question about itself for the depth study, as indeed it was in 2019 in this year's paper. Referencing that previous slide, just going into more detail, where do you go to deepen your knowledge and understanding, do some original reading. You've got another Stephen J. Lee chapter, a specific essay. There's a chapter called Outside the Volksgemeinschaft, and that's chapter 8. And obviously Volksgemeinschaft we've explored already, the idea of a national racial community, and there were the sort of scapegoat groups, the external enemies who were not considered by Hitler to be part of the Volksgemeinschaft, and of course the Jews were a key part of that, along with communists. So there's an essay he's written within that chapter. What role and with what effects did the concept of race play in the Nazi system? So I'll upload that essay to the Padlet area for you. Please make sure you read it and supplement your notes from that. Okay, don't rely just purely on class notes. That's obviously a crucial point. Also, and I've already gone past the previous slide, but there's a really useful chapter in the volume 2 of Noakes and Pridham about Jewish policy, and I've referred you particularly towards the end section of that chapter, which is about the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which we'll come on to later. Okay, nearly there in terms of the introduction. So the relevance of this topic, racial policy, to the examination, as I said there, try to view this as sort of almost like a case study of Nazi Germany. We've touched on many key themes so far. Within learning about Jewish policy between 1933 and 1935, you can pick up many strands, and you can actually use Jewish policy in many questions which are not specifically about Jewish policy. Okay, so I've already said you could use this information in a breadth study answer about German social policy between 1871 and 1990. You could quite easily bring in a reference to Jewish policy as appropriate, depending on the question. Within the depth study, and if you actually look here at the points, points 2, 3, and 4. So you've got point number 2. As we've seen within the depth study, you've got questions about the nature of the German Revolution that Hitler introduced at the beginning of the Third Reich. The legal revolution, etc., where you could quite easily reference Jewish policy there. Then there were those depth study questions, point number 3, about the nature of Hitler's rule. Was it polocratic? Was it efficient or inefficient? Party versus state, chaos, cumulative radicalization. Remember Mommsen's theory of the way in which policy evolved towards a more radical type of policy. Well, again, Jewish policy is an excellent case study. You could exemplify the point you're making by referring to material from this particular topic about Jewish policy. Number 4, questions about the Nazi core aim of creating a Volksgemeinschaft. That whole topic which we looked at in the last lesson about was Nazi rule built on popular consent. Well, again, you could quite easily bring in some information about Jewish policy into your answer to that type of question. But the first point is crucial there. You could get a question in the depth study in section B specifically about Jewish policy. And we know that because this video cast is being recorded in the summer of 2019, and this year's paper, the 2019 paper, had a question specifically about Jewish policy. How far do you agree that the Nuremberg Laws marked a change in the policy of the Nazi regime towards the Jewish population of Germany in the years 1933 to 35? So it could come up as a specific question. Very good example, really, of how tough A-level is that this is one lesson basically, one lesson out of about 80 hours of teaching. They could hone in very narrowly on that. Just one lesson or one topic that we've covered in one lesson can suddenly be basically a third of your final assessment. Okay, let's get into the detail then. So just to remind you, I'm not going to just read every single point out to you. I'll give an overview, and you pause and look at the notes. Now you've got a copy of the mind map there and lots of space around the edge. Okay, if you haven't got a copy of the mind map with you, then quickly sketch that out. Leave lots of space around the edge, and then as you go through the remainder of the slides, map key points around, map them off the strands that we've got that are starting off the mind map. Okay, the usual sort of thing. You know how it works. Okay, so we'll start off with the point outsiders. Okay, so that particular strand of the mind map there. Okay, so general points just to sort of like ease you into this topic. Okay, about outsiders, and as you can see, Jews. The point here, in a nutshell, is that Jews were, and it links to the idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, is that a key part of the process of creating a national community was to bring Germans together, was to create a unity of Germany, of German people, overcome those divisions of the Weimar era. And there were several ways of doing it, but probably the most effective way, in addition to focusing on Hitler the person, was to build up a myth that there were external enemies that were trying to undermine and that were trying to divide Germany. And the Jews were one of those external enemies. They really emphasised that they were not the only external enemies. In our mind, through history, because of the severity of what later happened with the Holocaust, the shock of the mass murder of the Jews, historians have perhaps become, I think quite rightly, have become very focused in on the Jews. But we also need to remember as historians that there were other groups that were targeted as being outsiders. Okay, so let's go through this. Okay, so there were three types of outsiders who did not belong to the Nazi racial community. The first were groups who were ideological opponents. Okay, so that really did not include the Jews. Okay, or not directly anyway. So we've covered that. An ideological opponent is somebody who is seen to be an outsider because of their views, their beliefs, in particular their political beliefs. And the key ideological opponents were the socialists and the communists. Any group who politically did not accept the regime, anybody who spoke out against Hitler was defined as being an outsider, did not belong to the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. You've then got, but also you've got religious individuals. The previous lesson we looked at the churches, and an example of that would be Pastor Niemöller, one of the Protestant opponents of the Nazi regime. So that's that first category. Then you've got another type of outsider who do not fit in, and they were what we call the asocials. And those are people, Germans, whose behaviour was viewed as being unacceptable. Now, again, remember when we talked about the Volksgemeinschaft, we said a good German was supposed to be absolutely selfless in all their thoughts and all their actions, working to strengthen Germany, to bring Germany together. So these sort of groups, alcoholics, tramps, prostitutes, etc., criminals, the work shy, even homosexuals, were defined by the Nazis as being social undesirables, and therefore they were not not welcome as being a good German. Okay, so these were dealt with through various measures, forced labour. Shockingly, in the summer of 1933, Hitler passed a law. Remember, he had the power by then to pass laws by himself because of the Enabling Act, called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditary Diseased Offspring, which included health courts and compulsory sterilisation so that these people could not reproduce, could not have children. And that included the sort of asocial groups that we're talking about there. It didn't include Jews. Okay, so I suppose the point we're making at this earlier phase, much of Nazi policies were targeting a wider group of outsiders that included Jews, but these groups, the ideological opponents and the asocials, were not necessarily Jews. They could be Jews. Okay, if a Jew was a tramp, then they would be classed as being an asocial, but there were many tramps who were not Jews. And likewise, if a Jew was a communist, and some Jews were communists, then they would fall victim for these reasons, but of course many communists were not Jews. So the spread was wider, okay, in terms of the groups that were targeted as being outside the Volksgemeinschaft. Then you've got the biologically inferior, and this is where we become very sort of like specific about the Jews, okay, about Jewish Germans, okay. Now we'll come on to this in a later slide, but let me just really emphasise, about 1% of Germans were Jews, Okay, we're talking about, in 1933, about 500,000, and that's a lot of Germans, a lot of Jews in Germany, but 500,000 out of a population of pushing 50 million is only 1 out of every 100 Germans were Jews. So a relatively small proportion of the population were Jewish. Okay, but this third category of what is an outsider would have covered the Jews specifically, because in Hitler's view, remember Hitler was a racist, and he defined Germanness not by culture or history, tradition, language, the usual ways in which we define nationality. Hitler defined nationality in a biological way. Okay, and this stemmed from his social Darwinism. It was a scientific form of racism. Okay, Hitler defined Jews as a biologically inferior, in a racial sense. Okay, a Jew was defined in Hitler's mind not by their religion, but it was specifically because they were seen to have inferior blood. Now again, Jews were part of a broader group. Okay, there were other Germans who fell into this category, such as gypsies, Slavs, people of Eastern European origin, but the hatred that Hitler felt towards the biologically inferior, which included broader groups such as gypsies and Slavs, was most fiercely directed against the 1% of Germans who were Jews. Okay, there's that figure, about 1% of the population is there. But again, other mentally and physically disabled. We mentioned earlier that sort of law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring, that compulsory sterilisation. Well, Germans who were mentally and physically disabled would have fallen into this sort of category of Germans who were weakening the national community because of their biological makeup, because of their physical makeup. Okay, so again, there were, of course, Jews who were mentally and physically disabled, but many of people who have had disabilities were not Jews. So again, this group did not necessarily just include Jews. Okay, now in 1939, Hitler authorised euthanasia. The sort of, well, nowadays we would call it mercy killing. There was nothing merciful about euthanasia at all. It was a absolutely dreadful and shocking policy that was introduced, and it was really the first sort of evidence that kind of like culminated into what later happened in the occupied East with the Holocaust. But about 70,000 were gassed in the early years of the war. And of course, this particular targeted many of these people, the mentally and physically disabled people. It's one of the few examples, actually, of a policy that Hitler cancelled, this sort of like gassing within Germany in the early years of the war because of the mentally and physically disabled, because there was a protest by a Catholic bishop called Bishop Galen of Munster who spoke out against it. A good example of Hitler's sensitivity to popular opinion, and that opposition by brave individuals could actually work. And Hitler learned from that. And so later on, when the decision was definitely concretely made that he wanted to gas all the Jews of Europe, because a key part of that is that the murder of the Jews would actually not happen in Germany. It would actually happen in the occupied East, particularly in Poland, because Hitler was very, very sensitive to the majority of German people witnessing these sorts of violent, radical policies towards the biologically inferior, as he called them. Okay, so that's the outsiders. Now let's move into the debate. And as you can see, the debate is largely about how Jewish policy has been seen over time by historians, and how the historians' views have changed over time. broadly speaking, and I suppose rather simplistically, and a sort of very much of a sort of debunked view, but we still need to be aware of it, is that if you go way, way back to the early 1920s when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and you kind of read Mein Kampf knowing that eventually, 20 years later, the Nazi regime during World War II murdered 6 million Jews, you can sort of like be selective in your reading of Mein Kampf, and you can sort of see references, and there's lots of references towards Hitler's hatred of Jews in Mein Kampf. And so an assumption therefore could be made that, Hitler, right from the beginning, was all set on eventually murdering all the Jews of Europe. And that's what it was all about, that when he took power in 1933, he knew that he eventually wanted to murder the millions of Jews. Now, after 60, 70 years of research and looking at the evidence, that view, the majority of historians today would pretty much reject that view. It is safest to view Nazi policy as being something that gradually evolved over time towards what happened in World War II. Now, of course, with this particular specification, the questions that you're answering, your focus is very much on the early years, 1933 to 35. So steer well clear of, in your head, thinking at that time Hitler was thinking, my intention is to sort of like murder all the Jews of Europe. Okay, as I say, at this particular time, we're talking about policy within Germany towards the 1%, the 500,000 German Jews. What was his policy? And most of the evidence, we talk now about gradualism, that Nazi policy towards the Jews was definitely discriminatory, no doubt about that. Okay, in Hitler's head, they were second class. He wanted to make their life difficult. But initially, and in particular the first 4 or 5 years, 1933 to 37, and remember our paper is about 33 to 35, the policy, Nazi policy, seemed to be more directed at separating them from ordinary Germans, ordinary in the sense that Germans who Hitler did not classify as being Jewish, who Hitler would call German Aryans, okay, Germans of, in Hitler's view, pure blood, untainted blood. So passing laws which would separate out the 500,000 Jewish Germans from the other Germans. But those laws and those measures in a relatively non-violent way, okay, that in the early years, for reasons which we'll look at, Hitler seemed to be very, very keen to minimise the violence against Jews. And it was only gradually, particularly from 1938 onwards, that we start to see the beginning of violence towards German Jews that, of course, culminated in the ultimate violence of World War II in the occupied East, which, of course, was the mass murder and, in particular, the Holocaust, the gassing of Jews from 1942 onwards. So over the years, there's been considerable debate amongst historians about this relatively moderate, these early policies, in which laws were discriminatory and separating Jews out and clearly intent on making their lives difficult. And the debate is, was that moderation just a camouflage? Okay, did Hitler, beneath the surface, beneath those sort of relatively moderate discriminatory measures of the early years, in his head, did he know that he eventually wanted to move towards a more radical policy, a more extremist policy? And if he did want to move towards a more radical policy, what was that radical policy that he wanted to move towards? Was it extermination? Most historians would probably say at this stage, Hitler wasn't really thinking that way. Many historians would say that he wanted to push Jews out of Germany, that he wanted to get them ultimately out of Europe. Many historians who would argue that in Hitler's head, ultimately he was thinking about pushing Jews beyond the boundaries of Europe to places like Siberia, even an African island called Madagascar. But we need to be very careful. There's no real direct concrete evidence that Hitler in his head in the early 1930s, and that's what you're talking about, envisaged mass murder. So it's safest that you steer clear from making that assumption. You could be on dicey grounds if you start talking about sort of mass extermination. We know that eventually happened, but that is it something that Hitler intended to happen from the very beginning? And there's a lot of convincing evidence to challenge that argument. Okay, so that's the kind of the debate. What most historians today believe then is in the early years, 33 to 37, Hitler pursued a policy of legalized discrimination. Now, of course, you know about that. We've done about the legal revolution. We know about the reasons why it was important to be seen to be doing things legally, because in Hitler's head, in the early years, foremost is the fact that he knows that the majority of German people, middle class, would not back him unless they saw him as restoring law and order. Okay, after the years of the Weimar Republic in which apparently law and order seemed to break down, in particular because of the Great Depression. So the expectation of German people is that Hitler was restoring law and order. And so if Hitler's going to pursue any form of discriminatory or radical policy or radical change, and think about the way in which he had created his dictatorship, he's got to justify it in every sense as being working within the Constitution. And so Jewish policy kind of like fits into that. Very, very conscious of the fact that if he is pursuing a violent policy towards the Jews at an early stage, that it could impact not just on his popular support within Germany, but also, remember, Hitler's got to tread very carefully in these early years with his policy of revisionism, sort of like sending out the signals towards the Allies that he is a peaceful leader who just simply wants a just full revision of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Well, he needs to send the right signals out abroad that he is not an out-of-control radical. So the consensus today is that Hitler aimed eventually for some form of final solution. I mean, that word final solution, we tend to associate it with the mass murder of Jews that eventually happened. But in Hitler's head, and if we see the phrase written down in a document from the 1930s, Hitler's final solution, actually, probably at that time, Hitler's final solution was just to get the Jews out of Germany eventually. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean the mass extermination that eventually happened. And most historians today, not all, would argue that it wasn't really until 1941, the third year of World War II, that we actually see Hitler's head finally shift towards the final solution, as it turned out, which was to mass murder the Jews of Europe. So the debate is very much about the decision-making progress, about what you can see what Jewish policy was. It seemed to be gradualist, but what were the underlying intentions? And of course, the argument is those underlying intentions changed over time, and the real radicalization of policy probably happened more at the beginning of World War II, although there was some evidence that from about 1938 onwards, policy became more radical. Okay, so all of that debate, it kind of like very much therefore links it about Hitler's his style of leadership. Was he a strong leader? Did he know what he wanted? And of course, you could argue that Hitler was indecisive, he wasn't clear, so you could bring Jewish policy into that debate as well. Okay, so next one, the nature of Hitler's anti-Semitism. Okay, and again you can sort of see the strands. So we'll just quickly sort of go through some of the key points here. Okay, So Hitler's hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism, is a complex thing. I suppose the most important thing is that there were different types of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism was not new. It was not new in Germany. There had been anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews before Hitler, and elsewhere in Europe, hatred of Jews was very, very common. You can go back 2,000 years. Jews, much of Jew hatred was because Jews were outsiders. They were originally, their homeland was the Palestine at the time of Christ. They were scattered throughout Europe, so they were always minority groups. And as was said in Germany, about 1% of the population of German Jews, of Germans were Jews. So popular resentment against Jews was common, okay? And periodically we call them pogroms. For whatever reason, across many European countries, Jews were targeted, okay? There's a woodcut there that shows German Jews being burned alive in the year 1338. But those sorts of events, tragically, were very common. And in other countries, it was not specifically a German characteristic. So I think understanding Hitler's hatred of Jews, we need to be very, very clear that anti-Semitism, there were various forms of anti-Semitism over time, and Hitler's hatred of Jews, we need to understand it within that bigger picture. So think of it this way: there were 4 specific types of Jew hatred that were common throughout Europe, okay, over this period. It didn't suddenly appear with Hitler, okay. There was religious Jew hatred, okay. That goes back to the time of the Crusades, okay. Many German people hated the Jews because they were not Christians, okay. That was not really the main reason Hitler hated Jews. Now, Hitler may have said that he disliked Jews because of their religious beliefs, but because Hitler said that doesn't mean that is the key reason. Hitler would say a lot of things to win support, okay, to get votes, to get people on his side, okay. So be mindful of that. Likewise, Jews were often hated because of their wealth. Okay, I won't go into the sort of details of it, but historically, the Christian Church, the Catholic Church in particular, had said that money lending was unchristian, and there was always a need for kings and of Europe to borrow money, and so historically, over time, Jews of all countries would often go into the money lending market. And so historically, not all Jews, but many of the big banking houses and insurance houses of Europe were owned by Jewish families. And what's interesting then is when countries hit difficult times, when there was a recession or a depression, etc., Jews who had wealth were often targeted as the cause of economic problems. There's a picture there of Jews being targeted in Paris in 1899. There was a lot of Jew hatred in Austria in 1873, which was a time of economic recession, and so on. So again, just because Hitler said that Jews, we dislike them because of their wealth and because of their economic activities, does not mean that's the main reason. Then you've got this one, hatred of Jews as biologically inferiors. Now, this was a new type of Jew hatred. It wasn't specifically Nazi. It appeared before Hitler, during the scientific revolution. We've already done about social Darwinistic ideas that gathered popularity with a minority of people, but across all countries, sort of radical groups, sort of like taking the sort of like Darwin's principles of the survival of the fittest and arguing that human societies operated to the same sort of laws, and sort of like extremist elements then applied that in terms of human race. And there were levels of superiority in terms of human race, and the higher races had a greater right to existence than the lower races. So Hitler got many of his racial ideas from somewhere, and he picked many of these up from what we call the social Darwinists. So again, Hitler's biological hatred of Jews was not something new. It was not something that Hitler invented. He picked it up in particular from his reading in Vienna when he was a young man and living as a sort of down and out in Vienna. And then you've got a fourth type, and that's the sort of like hating Jews because it's convenient to hate them. It's useful, okay? It can win you support if you're campaigning for power, or it can win you support if you are in power. And that, of course, it was very characteristic of Hitler, as we say, that he would conveniently blame Jews for Germany's problems, and that's within the Volksgemeinschaft. It's a way of overcoming division and pulling Germans together. They were a minority. They were often a visible minority because of the way they practiced a different religion. And many Germans had different reasons for disliking Jews, economic reasons, religious reasons, and so it was often convenient to attack, to criticise Jews as a way of winning support. And Hitler was not the first politician to do that. There were other right-wing politicians that had done that over the years before Hitler. So again, that was not necessarily unique. But those are all sort of like four key characteristics. So I suppose that's the sort of key point for you to understand, is that hatred of Jews did not begin with Hitler, and it was not specifically German. Okay, but Hitler drew upon all of these strands because it was a way of winning some form of support. But it was not the main way of winning support. I mean, Hitler had lots of ways of winning support for the Nazis, not least the fact that he promised to sort out economic problems and create jobs and so on and so forth. Okay, so on one level, Hitler and the Nazis were the product of a society that were already anti-Semitic. But it was unique in one sense. Hitler's hatred of Jews, okay, his hatred was completely obsessive, vindictive, dominated by racial hatred. In other words, racial policy was at the very core of Nazi ideology, Hitler's worldview. Unlike many other political groups that use anti-Semitism to win support, Hitler's was obsessive. It was, to use a phrase, almost like an article of faith. All other aims seemed to be secondary, but Hitler's vindictive blaming of Jews for all of Germany's problems, so targeting that 1% of the population and vindictively blaming them, it was sort of very sort of like startling. And if we're going to say that there's anything that was uniquely unique, that is the key point. So Nazis believed that a pure Aryan race, okay, and the German strength needed ultimately to be would be underpinned by interbreeding. That you need to weed out the blood of the weak groups, and so over time the policies needed to be introduced to sort of like separate out and to sort of like make sure that over the time, through generations, only the racially pure will have children, because the mixing of blood will weaken the German nation. Okay, so Hitler believed that the German Jews, who made up a mere 1%, were a key part of the weakening of the German nation, because every time a German Jew had sex with a non-German Jew, the child that produced was weakening the German bloodline. But really, even more sort of startling is Hitler believed that the Jews were deliberately conspiring to weaken Germany because they didn't have their own nation. They were scattered throughout Europe as a group of people. They didn't have their own nation. So he saw them as a vengeful group of people motivated by jealousy, deliberately plotting to bring down nations, all nations, not just Germany, by getting into the bloodstream and weakening the bloodstream of nations. So Nazi propaganda depicted Jews as being sort of like parasites, as being like vermin that needed to be sort of weeded out in one way or another. Okay, and that's the sort of like uniqueness of Nazi hatred. You look at the Goebbels propaganda and the propaganda that was produced. Now, again, that is not to say at this stage that Hitler is saying the solution is to murder the Jews. Okay, the message is Jews are impure, they need to be separated, and they needed to be reduced to second-class status. And encouraged to get out of Germany. Okay, but be very careful about making that step towards saying that this means that Hitler wanted to kill them. The evidence is at this stage he didn't really know what he wanted, what his final solution was. So it's important to remember, though, that although there was anti-Semitism in Germany before Hitler, the vast majority of Germans were not anti-Semitic. Again, hugely important, okay? The majority of Germans had no problems with Jews, okay? So the 99% of German people had friends who were Jews, neighbours of Jews who got on well with them. Now, there were many of these Germans who, at one time or another, may have been mildly anti-Jewish for different reasons, religious or economic, or even accepted or believed the scapegoat argument. But there was little radical hatred of Jews. The Nazis, that was a uniquely Nazi thing, but they were able to tap into mild Semitism and draw upon that and exploit it. But the majority of German peoples during the Third Reich and also before Hitler were not anti-Semitic. Okay, the majority of German Jews were what we call assimilated. They did not all sort of like wear the distinctive clothing or live in these sort of minority communities. So it's important to remember that the majority of people who voted for Hitler did so not because of his hatred of the Jews. That when people voted for Hitler, the main reason was because of the other factors, that he promised to solve unemployment, he promised to crush communism, he promised to create strong government. They were the sort of key reasons. So there's reference to a survey there in which Germans who voted for Hitler were asked, or who actually joined the party, why did he join the Nazi party? More than half of them didn't even mention Jews as a factor for that. Okay, so now we're going to get specifically into the actual policies towards the Jews that Hitler introduced in the early years. And I've just referenced for you that question from the 2019 paper. So put that into your mind. How far do you agree that the Nuremberg Laws marked a change? Now, the Nuremberg Laws were the most famous laws passed by the Nazis, passed in 1935, in September 1935. But we'll just quickly go through the early years, and then we'll move on to the Nuremberg Laws. But the question, of course, is about change, okay? And that, of course, is saying is, were they distinctly different from the early years, or in fact, were they mainly about continuity with the early years? And then we'll reach the conclusion to this video after that. Okay, so just remind you of the bigger picture here. If you look at the diagram, we've covered this on the right there. We've always talked about, in these early years, when 1933 to 35, it's a combination of two things. You've got uncontrolled violence from below, the energy of the SA, the violence against the communists, etc. But also, remember, Hitler at every stage is very, very keen to channel in that violence, to control it, to take that energy and to make it appear to be a legal action, sort of legalized violence. And that's largely because the majority of the German people, being middle class, are wanting clear evidence that Hitler is bringing about law and order. But also remember, the Allies, the Americans, the British, Hitler's got his mind on them as well. He needs to build up trade contacts, he needs investment from abroad, and he needs to sort of present himself as a moderate, not as a radical who is looking for war, as just simply a strong leader who wants to revise the Treaty of Versailles without going to war. So just keep that information in your head as part of the context. So those are the two driving forces, and we can see that very much in terms of Jewish policy. So here are the sort of key points. You've got that the drive from above, okay? So the Nazi Party leadership was very worried that if the measures against the Jews in these early years were too extreme, it could actually be very damaging to other short-term goals. Firstly, to the economy. The Nazis are trying to create jobs. If they, in an uncontrolled way, launch an attack against Jews, remember, Jews were significant employers, and it would actually damage the economy further because Jewish businesses were closed down, which would increase unemployment, and that would impact on Hitler's popular support at a time when he desperately needs to increase his popular support by saying he is creating jobs. Secondly, international opinion. Remember, Hitler is trying to convince the British and the Americans that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles need to be revised. The main strategy is to play the role of being a responsible moderate statesman who is just simply pushing firmly for justice and a revision of Versailles. He doesn't want any sort of thoughts that he is intending to go to war eventually. And so if his policies against the Jews are too radical, it would be damaging to those goals. And thirdly, that sort of key notion about Hitler's popular support. Hitler's very, very sensitive to his own popularity. His power is based not so much on terror, but on popularity, on consent. And the middle-class Germans, Hitler's main supporters, can't stomach violence. They want to know that German life is orderly, and they've backed Hitler because the violence they see is useful against the communists, but violence against decent, law and orderly Germans is something that they cannot stomach. So therefore violence against Jews who are upstanding members of the German community is something that other Germans are not necessarily going to be able to tolerate. So all of those factors are important. But at the same time, you've got the party, the radicals, the grassroots activists, the people who joined the party from the early 1920s, and they dislike Jews intensely, and so they want action to be taken against Jews. They want immediate action. And of course, they often are uncontrolled, and so in particular the SA, when they were out storming the streets in early 1933, attacking communists, the violence would often overspill because they hated German Jews, and so they would kick and beat up German Jews on the streets. And Hitler needs that energy, but that energy needs to be controlled. But at the same time, if he needs to make sure that his policies appease and keep happy the radicals in the party. Otherwise, the radicals in the party will believe that Hitler is sold out. So somehow he needs to strike the balance between these two opposing forces that are in operation in these early years. So that's a crucial point. So policy, therefore, seemed to balance these two driving forces by taking hold of grassroots activism, which is from below, and diverting it into a legal, orderly, non-violent channel from above. And we can sort of see that, and that helps us understand what then happened. So in the first couple of months after Hitler became Chancellor, during the early days of Gleichschaltung, there was considerable uncontrolled violence against the Jews. Okay, so during the National Uprising campaign, a lot of SA violence overspilled into violence against Jews. They didn't distinguish between communists and Jews. When they saw them on the streets, they would often physically attack Jews. What we do know is that caused Hitler considerable anxiety because it damaged business, it damaged Hitler's own image, and it was damaging to economic recovery. So what's interesting then is the first measure that Hitler took against the Jews was he announced a one-day national boycott of Jewish shops. Okay, messages were sent out, don't buy in Jewish shops. But if we actually look at that, although that seems really shocking to encourage Germans not to buy from Jewish jobs, we can actually see it in the context of trying to channel SA hatred into a more orderly form of action. Let's not beat them up, let's just simply put ourselves in front of the shop and discourage Germans from buying their goods. And what we also learn is it didn't actually work. German people wanted to buy from Jewish shops, and they simply walked past the SA men who stood in the doorway. But we can see a lot from that. And then on the 7th of April 1933, Hitler passed the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, and it excluded Jews from being civil servants. But interestingly, Hindenburg stepped in and insisted that Jews who had served Germany in World War I, fighting for Germany in World War I, be excluded from that particular law. So again, within that, we see all sorts of things. We see evidence of Hitler's weakness. We see it because Hindenburg stepped in and made an exception. But we also see evidence of the fact that Hitler's trying to channel anti-Semitism into a legal process by passing laws to discriminate them, to take away their jobs in key areas that he doesn't want them to work, which is saying, I don't want violence on the streets. So, lots of other examples. The law for the exclusion of Jewish journalists. And many, many more laws between 1933 and 34. Segregation laws, forcing them to use separate facilities. They had to have separate parks. They had to go to separate swimming pools, etc., etc. But in the context of this, Hitler is trying to channel radicalism into a non-violent channel. So how then do we understand the Nuremberg Laws? Okay, what were they? What were their origins and why were they important? So again, just remind you of that sort of key question. So from 1934 onwards, we start to see racial policy becoming of a greater focus. And although Hitler in 1933 to 34 has tried to channel that anger within the party, that hatred of Jews, into legal routes, by 1935 we start to see frustration at the grassroots amongst the party members themselves, the radicals, the people who joined the party because they really hate the Jews. We start to see it beginning to rear its head again. So as we move into 1935, there was a resurgence again of violence on the streets against the Jews. It was not planned. It's evidence of Hitler's weakness in a sense. Hitler did not really want it to happen. But we start in the summer of 1935 to sort of see this violence happening again, uncontrolled. And Hitler's conservative partners, in particular Schacht, and in particular leading civil servants, members of the Nazi Party, so members who are not conservatives who do not belong to the Nazi Party, but Hitler, remember at this stage, has kept them in office to sort of like manage many of the sort of key policies that he knows the party can't manage themselves, start again to express concern, as they did in 1934, when the SA behaviour got out of control. And so again, the Conservatives are saying, look, this violence by grassroots activists needs to be brought under control and diverted into legal channels. And so in the summer of 1935, in August, Hitler gave a clear order to the party, stop these random attacks. Okay? But the frustration is there. It's like people are crying out saying, well, what do you want us to do then? We've joined the party because you have said that the Jews are enemies of Germany, and yet we want more concrete action to be done against them. And that's the sort of context then of what then happened, because every September Hitler held a big, huge party rally in the German city of Nuremberg. It was a major set piece every September. And he always, on these occasions, gave a big speech to the massed crowds of German people who gathered to hear their leaders speak. And in the rally of September 1935, Hitler had planned to give a speech about foreign policy, but at the last minute, for reasons that aren't really important, he suddenly had to cancel that message. He couldn't speak about foreign policy, but he needed to fill his speech with something else. And so on that particular point, this man here, Gerhard Wagner, who was actually the Reich Doctors leader, sort of effectively whispered in Hitler's ear and said, look, the party are getting frustrated with you because you're telling them they can't use violence against the Jews, and yet you need to do something to keep the party happy that Jews are being relegated to a second-class status. So it was Wagner who sort of like said, look, why don't you make your key speech about Jews? And so as a way of sending these messages out. So at short notice, before the rally, Hitler called upon his leading civil servants and says, I want you to draw up some legislation that will restrict Jewish rights in Germany in a more major way than previously. And interestingly, the civil servants drew up 4 drafts what we call the Nuremberg Laws, and they presented them to Hitler, and Hitler actually selected the most moderate. Okay, which again tells you that keeping an eye on the big picture, Hitler knows it's really important to keep the conservatives on his side and to keep the British and the Americans on his side. He's not ready to move towards a radical policy just yet. And so these key laws that everyone talks about, the new so-called Nuremberg Laws, are kind of evidence of, in a sense, Hitler, of his weakness. He really did not know what he wanted. And he's responding to pressures from his own party. Wagner is the person who's putting pressure on him. So it's evidence of a leader who kind of like lacks direction, in a sense, who was a weak dictator. So that's why it's a good example of what you could use when you write your own. You could get an essay about Hitler's style of leadership and about the power of Hitler, and you could bring this, the Nuremberg Laws, in as an excellent example for that. So what exactly were they? Well, it's well documented. They were actually a series of linked laws. The most famous one is basically the law for the protection of German blood and honour. It was made illegal for non-Jewish Germans and Jewish Germans to be married or have sexual relations. So that was a major change, okay? And remember, that essay question is about change, okay? So now it is against the law to marry or a non-Jewish German or to have sexual relations. It forbade them to fly the German flag, a clear message: you absolutely are outside. So on national patriotic days, Jewish families were not allowed to fly the flag, even though they were very patriotic, and this 1% of Germans, of Jews who were Germans who were Jews, had lived for generations in Germany. They'd fought for their country. They were very proud to be Germans. They were no longer allowed to be proud of that. And crucially, their citizenship was taken away. So they were designated as subjects, which is pretty much saying, we want you to leave Germany. Now, in the meantime, if your citizenship is taken away, your new status was you are merely here as a guest, but as an unwanted guest. So the message is, we want you to leave Germany, to emigrate. So in that sense, clear evidence of change. Think of that essay question. A supplementary article was passed in November 1935 that attempted to define who was classified as Jewish. And that was always a real difficulty, because how do you classify a Jew who's got three Jewish grandparents, but one of the grandparents is actually an Aryan, or two Jewish grandparents, and so the Nazis then tried to bring in all sorts of criteria about, well, if you've got two Jewish grandparents but two Aryan grandparents, but you are a practicing Jew in your faith, then you are a Jew, but if you are a non-practicing Jew, you're not, or and so on. And they got into a real tangle over that, what we call the Mischlinge part Jews. That exception, now Hindenburg, remember, has died. Remember, he stepped in the 7th of April and said Jews who fought for World War I could keep their jobs in the civil service. Part of the Nuremberg Laws is that exception was lifted, so those Jewish World War I veterans were now removed from their employment and legally second-class citizens. So, yeah, the significance, there are sort of 5 key points here about the significance of the Nuremberg Laws. It pleased the radical elements of the party, no doubt about it. But it also pleased Hitler's conservative partners. It's a very good example of striking that balance. Hitler caught in the middle, trying to keep both sides happy, and by channeling the anti-Semitism once again into a concrete law, it in a sense brought under control the violence that might have happened and that was happening in the summer of 1935. But we can also see it really as a first step now in a process of increasingly pushing the Jews to a more final solution. And of course, at this stage, you could argue the final solution is emigration. But it is certainly clearly saying you are second class. It's brought everything together, all the laws of the earlier period, into a sort of clear definition of the fact that you are not wanted here. And in a sense, you could sort of like see that the process of the final solution, the eventual Holocaust, arguably, in a sense, began at that particular point, because it is moving towards a sort of more radical. So I said 5 points, I meant 3 points. So finally, just in terms of conclusions, and where there are sort of like 5 key points just to bring it together. The first, okay, in terms of an assessment, remember that point, most Germans were not anti-Semitic, okay? Or if there was anti-Semitism, it was not of the sort of like rabid biological kind that characterised the Nazis. Secondly, Nazi measures against the Jews did cause a lot of bad publicity abroad, no doubt about it. And Hitler was very, very aware of that and responsive. And understanding that is a key to understanding Jewish policy between 1933 and 1930. Next, Jews seem to respond in 2 ways to the anti-Semitic legislation. Okay, clearly Jews' extensive rights were being steadily eroded. Okay, and definitely many of the younger Jews responded by emigrating. Okay, which is clearly what Hitler wanted. But on the other hand, interestingly, particularly with the Nuremberg Laws, many of the older Jews kind of like responded and thought, well, we now know our status. It's now been clearly defined by law in the Nuremberg Laws. And that actually, ironically, against Hitler's intentions, convinced many Jews, particularly the older generation of German Jews, okay, we can now stay. The decision has been made. We are no longer citizens, we're guests, but at least we now know where we are. And so many Jews, ironically, saw it as a sign of things will now settle down. Fourthly, there's much evidence in the early years to support the weak dictator argument, as we said. Hitler didn't really seem to know what he wanted or how to bring it about. And he has been forced to be responsive to the pressures of other people, in particular the conservatives and the allies, to tone things down, to make sure it's legal. But he's also under pressure from his own party to make things more radical, kind of like frustratingly trapped in the middle, which you could use as arguments of weakness. And there is evidence that the Nuremberg Laws, fifthly, was introduced mainly because of pressure on Hitler by other Nazis, and that's where Noakes and Pridham, that the reading I gave you earlier, is really, really useful. So hopefully that's useful for you. I'll finish there. When I see you next, we're going to move into that sort of the final topic, which is the breadth study economic change topic, and we'll look at Nazi economic policy between 1933 and 1945. So to prepare for that, can you go to the textbook, please, and read pages 54 to 57? That's flip learning for our first lesson next week. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful to you.